at the Macmillan Center, Yale University, and we have the pleasure of having Charis Marantzidou with us today. Thank you for taking the train from New York on this day with such a bad weather. It's snowing here in New Haven. It's a bit cold. I know we have people from warmer climates in the audience. That's great. So I'll present Charis, and then we'll have the chance to hear her arguments on the Russian emigres in Greece. If you have any questions on the presentation, please use the Q&A button in the webinar to post them. So Charis is a PhD student in modern European history at Columbia University. Her research focuses on modern Russia and the Soviet Union, with a particular interest in the communities of the Russian diaspora in Europe. Before coming to Columbia, Charis completed a master's in international history at the London School of Economics, and she holds a BA in liberal arts from Sarah Lawrence College in Bronxville, New York. So thank you again, Charis, and without further ado, all yours.
Thank you. So hi from me as well. I will be talking today about the Russian emigres in Greece, and the question of this presentation is where do they function between, were they in between departure or integration? So I became interested in this topic a few years ago while I was working on my master's thesis at the National Archives in Britain, where I discovered a letter, and I will begin this presentation by reading to you an excerpt from this letter, which was written by the Committee of White Russian Officers, and it was addressed to the Greek Parliament in the summer of 1921. The letter was asking for the extension of the Russian stay at a hospital in Athens after the government requested that they evacuate the hospital in order to make room for the wooden soldiers coming from the Asia Minor front. So the letter reads as follows. Greek brothers in faith, we the Russian exiles beg your government not to condemn us, your Christian brothers, to death. We're ill and injured. Do not abandon those who fought against the worst enemy of civilization to starve. Remember Russia's days of glory and greatness, when many of your compatriots saw her as a second home, and they're referring to the Greeks of Southern Russia. Russia, whose history is closely tied to the Hellenic resurrection. Once reborn, we find the strength to thank you for your aid. Your help is urgent, there's not enough time. So who are these refugees? Today I'm focusing on the Russian emigres who fled from the former Russian Empire after 1917 and the Russian Civil War, and who are known as the first wave of Russian immigration. There's certainly a problem of estimations that pretty much all scholars in the field have acknowledged. And so the overall number of people who fled is estimated to be between 800,000 and 2 million, though some of the most accurate estimations state something like 1.4 million people. So some of you may know that several stereotypes surrounded this group of emigres, and that they were mostly wealthy aristocrats with ultra right-wing beliefs. But by this point, most scholars have rejected these views. The immigration was much more heterogeneous in its nature, and the emigres were much more ethnically diverse. For example, there were Baltic, Germans, Ukrainians, Georgians, and they engaged in a wide variety of occupations, professions that were mostly associated with the middle class, such as engineers, topographers, professors, and many farmers, given the high number of Cossacks that were amongst the emigres. So refugees followed different paths to exile. The evacuations from the Crimea and other Black Sea port cities, such as Odessa, Novorossiysk, Batumi, was one of the ways, and it consisted approximately of 200,000 people, mostly General Wrangel's and Deniki's white armies, and a few hundred of their family members. A significant portion often fled to Poland, whereas 10% approximately emigrated through the east and ended up in China. So the refugees we're talking about, those who passed through and in some cases resided in Greece in the early 1920s, usually belonged in the first group that I described, and they're those who fled through the Black Sea and often gathered in Constantinople and then Greece in transit to other states. According to estimations by the League of Nations, over 30,000 people were in Greece in 1921, and around 50,000 passed through Greece in the early 1920s. However, and that is the central problem of this presentation, by the mid-1920s, the number of Russians had dropped to below 5,000. So this is a map of the immigration, and even though the number is actually not very accurate in some cases, I just wanted to show that the émigrés expanded all over Europe, and we see China in the United States, Brazil. In France, you can't really see the number, but it was 400,000. So it is a large group of refugees in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution. In this presentation, I want to make 2 points. The first is that we need to understand the arrivals, departures, and finally, the impact of the Russian émigrés in Greece as part of a broader context of Russian immigration after the Bolshevik takeover. Despite the community's small size, the Greek community, the community of Russians in Greece, I argue that it belonged to a greater interconnected network of what became known as Russia abroad, or what historian Laurie Manchester referred to as an extraterritorial nation that extended across the 5 continents and that treated the host countries as temporary waiting rooms. My second point, which carries beyond the materials that I'll be discussing today, is about Greece and the international refugee regime that came into existence in the aftermath of the First World War. I want to suggest that the concept of the third or transit state for refugees and displaced people, which was largely recognized in the 1951 Refugee Convention, in fact had its origins in Greece, in Interwar Greece, as Greek and international humanitarians attempted to find a solution to the 2 intertwined crises, the Russian one and the refugees from Asia Minor. So the first organized arrivals in Greece concerned approximately 1,000 white émigrés and began in May 1919 with ships provided by the Greek government, even though certain oral accounts actually state that they arrived as early as 1918. The first group of émigrés were composed of mainly officers and soldiers, some of whom had brought along with them members of their families, and who had been evacuated, as I said before, from the port cities of the Black Sea. Their transfer was urged by the British military after they called for a friendly allied country for the refugee safe settlement. And judging that the direct transfer of the Russian refugees to England was not a practicable option, the British Foreign Office requested that the Greek counterparts and allies allow the refugees to disembark on the Greek territory. And then the final defeat of General Wrangler's army in the Battle of Crimea in November 1920 marked the largest departure of refugees since the beginning of the war, which was approximately 200,000 people. For the majority of Russian émigrés, their first stop was Constantinople, but as Constantinople was swamped with exhausted and malnourished refugees, the spread of epidemics, as well as the paucity of medical and sanitary care, the transfer of some of the thousands of refugees to neighboring countries was actually rendered necessary. So the French military, which had become the primary force in charge of the management of the white émigrés in the Near East, and up until that point, it was also the British actually, but because of a fallout with the white Russian elites, they they basically let the French assume the logistical burden of humanitarian aid. And so from that point onwards, the French military authorities called for further assistance by members of the League of Nations. When the Greek army arrived at the port cities of the Black Sea, Greek representatives admitted that the refugee crisis was graver than they had anticipated. Given the conditions and the growing levels of concern, the Greek government felt morally obliged to extend its mission to refugees of non-Greek descent. From that moment onwards, the Greek authorities gave the green light for the entrance of émigrés into Greece. And as a lot of you may know, Greece was, of course, a member of the Allied intervention in Southern Russia and Ukraine in 1918, because it was hoping to get a seat at the negotiating table with the Europeans and also get their support for its own plans in Asia Minor. And during this failed expedition, they came into first-hand contact with the humanitarian crisis, especially as thousands of ethnic Greek refugees were in southern Russia and the Caucasus. So it is fair to say that until their arrival in Ukraine, the Greek government and the army had no real sense of the scale of the crisis. However, they still interpreted the reception of refugees from Russia only as a short-term problem, whereby Greece would serve as a temporary stop before repatriation to Soviet Russia or Europe. In Constantinople, which was the largest refugee hub in the Near East, the numbers of refugees kept rising. In 1920, there were approximately 65,000 civilians and 70,000 soldiers. And the spread of typhus and other diseases, as well as, again, the hygienic concern related to the overwhelming numbers of refugees, demanded the mobilization of nearby regions for the population transfers. So the French army organized the transfer of approximately 5,000 soldiers to the Greek island of Lemnos and set out a plan to transfer 20,000 people to the peninsula of Gallipoli. And here we see a couple of photos from, they're not particularly clear, but these are the living conditions of Russians in Constantinople. And here we see a camp in Gallipoli, and further up, it's the Russian military authorities meeting the French military authorities in Gallipoli. And this is Russian general background. So given the geographical proximity to Constantinople, the Allies saw the temporary transfer of Russian refugees to other camps in the Aegean vicinity as a necessary solution. However, the Greek side was not actually an active participant in this decision-making process. The French authorities, in their request that actually seemed more like a formality, they contacted the Greek Foreign Ministry requesting their permission to disembark the Greek refugees, but the disembarking was actually already in progress. So 10,000 Cossack soldiers settled in Lemnos, and according to a Greek scholar who has studied the subject, the plan was to actually settle 60,000 by the spring and 25,000 to Gallipoli. So the soldiers would then get distributed to Greek cities depending on their capacity. And the major concentration areas of the Greek mainland were Salonika, Volos, and Kavala. Despite the hardship, for the most part, until the summer of 1921, the conditions in Greece did not differ considerably from other refugee camps in the rest of Europe. The French had undertaken most of the financial burden, and the Russian Mutual Aid Fund, which was an initiative led by the Russian ambassador's wife and representatives of the Russian Red Cross, which was established in 1919, aimed to assist the daily costs. The Russian agency Zemgor, which was created during the First World War as a philanthropic organization, also assumed some of the philanthropic costs of the whole enterprise. Greek parishes organized soup kitchens and often clothing donations, and the first Red Cross agencies supervised the mission. These are a couple of photos from, this is a tent, a camp tent in Greece, and this, I think, is a religious ceremony on Lemnos, but could also be some other sort of gathering. But it's from my sources, I think that it's a religious ceremony. In day-to-day life in Greece, its Russian refugee received a sufficient amount to cover the basic needs. Though employment was limited, some Russians succeeded in finding temporary work, either in services and construction projects or at farms in rural Greece. In Salonika, the American Red Cross reported that over a dozen women were employed as waitresses at local cabarets and restaurants. There was also a Russian orchestra and various Russian dances. And then in the camps of Athens and Salonika, again, the Russian Red Cross and the embassy organized workshops in boot making, dressmaking, carpentry, painting to qualify the refugees for future employment. However, in the camps of Limon and Gallipoli, where most of the white soldiers were living, reality was worse than in the cities. The descriptions about the living conditions in the camps, mostly from diaries and letters and reports that were sent by the refugees, requested their eventual transfer out of their camps. One general named Kalinin wrote in his memoir that the wind and the cold were the refugees' main enemy. There were constant flows of refugees that swamped the existing camps, and often refugees lived in large barracks and tents, like these ones you see over there, and where often 14 men would be crammed together. Men often slept on the ground for some grass and rugs, and from January 1921 onwards on straws that were distributed by the French. Only a few bigger tents were equipped with electricity, and the small ones were equipped with candles and oil lamps. And of course, starvation was another part of the daily life. It's interesting because some of the most remarkable issues between the between the Russians and the Allies emerged out of the Allies' attempt to demobilize and disarm the white armies and to treat them like civilian refugees rather than soldiers. The decision, however, often didn't sit well with the whites, especially because they were hoping to return back to Russia and fight against the Bolsheviks. So violent confrontations often erupted, and we have a couple of reports that stated that they engaged in duels. So this is another picture from the Camp Limnos, and here it's a soccer game between French and Russians in Limnos.
Which year is that?
1920, I believe. So reports from the Bureau of the Russian Press indicate, however, that the camps were regularly supplied with Russian newspapers distributed to the Greek camps from the Émigrés headquarters in Constantinople. Russian Émigrés newspapers published in Paris, Berlin, and Belgrade, and Harpin were distributed wherever there was. Oh, sorry, that was I meant to show this as well. This is a Russian school. I will refer to it in a bit. Russian Émigrés newspapers that were published in all these different cities where Russian émigrés lived were distributed wherever there was an émigré population. Emotional in their nature, with vivid descriptions of and symbolism of pre-revolutionary life, white leaders, Cossack atamans, and important cultural figures often made appeals to the scattered Russian immigration to remain strong and to not forget the significance of the immigration's mission, that is, to regroup and return to overthrow the Bolshevik regime. In their effort to do so, exiles formed lobbies pressuring governments, international agencies, and European lawmakers. They established cultural and political centers such as school, like the one that I showed you before, cultural clubs, trade unions. The most famous was actually in Paris, the trade union of the Russian taxi drivers. And they all proclaimed their commitment to the future restoration of old Russia while ensuring that the Russian cultural values would be preserved. Russians across Europe could read appeals that white generals made about the living conditions of the immigration across the world. Parisian newspapers especially took a keen interest in the living conditions of Russian communities in Greece. For instance, in 1920 and 1921, which is when these newspapers were published, they regularly wrote articles about the refugee camps of Athens and Thessaloniki. So this is about the refugee camps in Athens, and below we're talking about Thessaloniki, and here it's the Russians in Greece. And they reported the difficulties of the Russians to find employment. However, they also reported the positive events that were taking place, like the associations of mutual aid among the refugees, as well as updates on visa processes, resettlements, celebrations of Easter, of Christmas, etc. So the church, of course, was another crucial factor in exile. as it became the Émigrés cultural repository. For instance, the Russian student Christian movement, established in 1923 in Czechoslovakia and then moved to Paris, was a social religious organization that aimed to promote Russian theology and Russian cultural studies. It advertised its mission and provided scholarships for Russian Émigrés students across the immigration. And in their yearbooks, which are currently held at the Bahmete Vargaev at Columbia University, we see the names of Russian students across Europe, included Greece. So there are a couple of students who we know were living in Greece and they studied in the schools. In letters and reports of Russian refugees, we see that they often spoke about Greece, but at least until 1924, the year when most European governments, including Greece, began to recognize the Soviet government, the Émigrés did not expect to stay in Greece permanently, or in immigration for that matter. As I mentioned already, exile was supposed to be a temporary stage, only an opportunity to regroup until the white armies could engage in a new war and fight the communist regime. But in 1923, the number of refugees dropped to 4,000 from over 30,000 in 1921 that I had mentioned in the beginning of the presentation. A year later, in the spring of 1924, the number decreased to 3,000 people, and were almost only those that had managed to secure employment. So what explains this drop? The situation for the refugees in Greece deteriorated when the French government announced that it would no longer defray the expenditure of the Russian refugees in the Near East after the spring of 1921, meaning that the Greek government would now assume the logistical burden of the Russian refugees who were in Greece at the time. However, the Greco-Turkish War in the Near East, which has started 2 years earlier, had already taken a downwards turn for the Greek side, and a new refugee crisis began to unravel, which we commemorate this year, the 100 years from the catastrophe in Smyrna. So according to Greek historians, by 1924, there were 1.2 million Greek refugees from Asia Minor. But already in 1920, Greece was host to 500,000 people from Bulgaria, Thrace, as well as Asia Minor, and of course, the Russian Émigrés. So in this context, it's not surprising that the Russian Émigrés were not a priority. And it's actually quite interesting because the Russian Émigrés became something of a scapegoat for members of the Greek government who were seeking financial and humanitarian relief from their European counterparts. For instance, the Minister of Internal Affairs in late 1921 argued that it was time to stop the influx of Russian refugees, otherwise the country will face irreparable disasters. Local authorities, especially on the islands, Limnos and Chios as well, frequently complained about the Russian presence. And it's interesting because in a few cases in their reports, they wrote their fear of spreading Bolshevism, even though, as you know, these former white soldiers were far from left-wing politics and let alone Bolshevism. But for the refugees themselves, the situation in Greece was deteriorating. The daily distribution had fell from 6 drachmas originally to 1.5. And according to the International Committee of the Red Cross, it could barely suffice for bread for the refugees. Medical supplies were also in high demand as the flows of ill refugees kept rising. And it is indicative that within just the months of February and March of 1921, there were up to 1,000 deaths in Thessaloniki. In Limnos specifically, there were 350, whereas in Gallipoli, the death toll was 3 times that. So because of the general condition, disorder and unrest were commonplace. There were even several cases of robberies reported to local police stations. And sometimes these reports indicated that Russian soldiers had broken into village shops only to steal bread and a pack of cigarettes. In view of this limited resources, the Ministries of Health and Interior Affairs decided in a drastic move in late 1921 to evacuate 993 Russian refugees who were found in a critical condition and had been hospitalized in hospitals in the Greek capital. The administrative authorities of public hospitals gave them a 5-day deadline to find accommodation, and their plea was the letter I read to you in the beginning of the presentation. By 1922, the League had actually become the main forum that the Greek government could use to advocate for its overwhelming refugee arrivals. And as many of you may know, since its formation, the League functioned as a central actor in structuring a comprehensive refugee regime and established provisions and protections for the refugees. The League had assigned the Norwegian explorer Fridtjof Nansen to centralize the works of various relief agencies and governments under one umbrella institution, and that is the High Commission of Refugees. And as many scholars have asserted as well, the Russian émigrés and their flight from war-ridden Russia was the crisis that inaugurated these mechanisms. And the most famous example of these mechanisms is the Nansen passport. So Russian émigrés were granted the Nansen passport by the League of Nations, which was a form of alternative documentation that was granted to Russians following the Soviet government's decision to denationalize the subjects of a former Russian empire. And although it did not grant citizenship to its holders, it actually did allow them to cross borders in search of employment and prevented refugees from deportation. It is interesting that the Greek government was actually one of the fiercest supporters of the Nansen passport. And as historian Lena Divan has stated in her study, the Russian refugees mentioned the Greek authority, in her study of the Russian refugees, she mentioned that the Greek authorities construed Nansen's initiative as a positive development because it would allow free space for Greece to host and employ the Asia Minor refugees. So in exchanges with High Commissioner Nansen, the Greeks often stated that it would be totally impossible for Greece to make fresh sacrifices for the benefits of Russians in view of the thousands of Greeks that were coming to the Greek territory from Turkey. They kept saying that the Russian émigrés will have to be evacuated from Greece, even if the League decides to provide material assistance to them, it will be up to the Greek government to decide the tasks it would undertake, along with the number of refugees it would keep. So to pressure the commissioner further, the Greeks threatened to stop the daily allowance, the 1.5 drachmas they were giving them to the point, and in order to allocate it to the ongoing crisis, that is the refugees from Asia Minor. So they did not actually end up implementing that, but it did scare the European authorities. The adoption of the Nansen passport allowed most of the Russian refugees to leave Greece for other states. Many reports show that refugees themselves wish to be temporarily transferred to new host countries, mostly based on the family reunification principle. Some letters written by Russian émigrés showed how vexed they were with their lives in Greece, and specifically claimed that the Greek authorities had never been interested in them and that they were left to die and starve, etc. In the Russian press, of course, as I showed before, the situation in Greece received widespread coverage, especially after the news of a steamboat of a few hundred émigrés who decided to self-repatriate to Soviet Russia. There were a couple of attempts for repatriation that were organized by Nansen, and they would start from Bulgaria and go to south of Russia, but we actually don't know what happened to them. So to the émigrés' dismay, Europe's establishment of diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union in 1924 meant that their eventual return to the motherland would have to wait longer. Thus, the communities faced an existential dilemma. How to pursue integration into the new societies without assimilation, while also managing to maintain collective attachment to the Russian culture and tradition. And it is in this context that I want to highlight that the politics of gender actually began to matter in the Russian communities across Europe. And I'd like to emphasize that the conditions of life actually determined another important feature of the community in Greece, and that is the gender ratio. So given that a large number of the Russian émigrés emerged out of the evacuations of the army evacuations in 1920, and the communities of Russia abroad included inevitably more men than women, which effectively meant that more men would marry non-Russian women. That's raising concerns about cultural cohesion and attachment to language, tradition, etc. So among the diaspora groups, the idea that women were more likely to remain committed to tradition was a widely accepted view, and the Russians held that dearly. Russian women were actually imagined as guardians of Russian identity and as essential in continuing Russian tradition in exile. And given the gender imbalance in the community, women were in high demand. And therefore, the Russian mother assumed a kind of affective and practical significance for some of the patriarchal authorities in the diaspora. So there was this perception that if the mother is foreign, the children are foreign. And although for the Russians in Greece, the fact that thousands of Russian-speaking, though ethnically Greek refugees were present in the same country facilitated a cultural bond, still many prefer to settle in other countries with more robust Russian communities. And it's interesting because from a couple of oral interviews with descendants, I also noticed that in cases where marriage between ethnic Greeks and Russians occurred, actually the children and the parents and the children, they ended up assimilated. So the children were raised as Greeks, the parents had got jobs to learn Greek. This is one, I found this document really fascinating when I first saw it. And here is a stamp, a transit stamp for refugees entrance in Greece. And it's actually really interesting because we see the continuous transit stages of the refugees. So this is one example of family that actually stayed in Greece for a couple of months, but then they ended up settling elsewhere. So to conclude, in the 1920s, the vast number of refugees turned Greece into a site for the humanitarian experiments of the 20th century. The convergence of the Russian refugee crisis, which was at its core an international problem, that international governments attempted to solve collectively in coordination with the League. And of course, the Greco-Turkish exchange of population, which was undoubtedly a crisis of grave humanitarian significance. However, it was solved within a binational framework. What I have suggested in this presentation is that these two intertwined, a refugee crisis and the ways they converged in Greece are essential to understand how humanitarian mechanisms came into existence in the interwar era. And in many ways, the fact that such few numbers of Russians remained in Greece suggests that the League was actually successful in distributing the humanitarian burden across different nations. International humanitarians, government officials, as well as the émigrés themselves refer to Greece as a transit state, a reputation that has lasted until today, when under a new set of historical circumstances, Greece has reemerged as a transit state for thousands of Syrian refugees. And as we're speaking, new refugee crises have already begun to unravel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charis. Until the audience starts posting the questions online in the Q&A section, I would like to invite questions from the local audience here.
Yeah. Thank you very much. This was a magnificent presentation.
A bit louder, please.
I very much appreciate the kind of global overview that you gave us here, and also the pointed themes there. I have a great many questions myself, but I'm gonna sort of restrict myself to two so far. Where in all of this does orthodoxy fit, if at all? I know you spoke about marriage, about gender, and about assimilation there? Is there any kind of discourse there, any kind of rhetoric, any kind on the part of the government, on the part of organizations of these refugees about Orthodoxy? Because as we all know, the relations between Russians and Greeks, were not particularly, shall we say, amicable for the 50 years before this. So that would be, if your documents allow you any glimpse in that, that would be really very helpful. And the second thing that I was intrigued by was, and you pointed out, or like you made a kind of hint to that at some point, and I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on this, please. Is great many of them were military sort of related people, officers, soldiers, and so on, with or without families, but there were also many civilians there. Do you see any difference in the way they experienced the kind of sort of various aspects that you said? Thank you so much.
Yeah, so Orthodoxy is incredibly important, and at least the significance that I've seen a lot is firstly, in terms of the cultural affinity, right? That even for people who up until the revolution, they weren't interested in religion, they weren't religious themselves, some of them were actually liberal or even left-wing, mostly civilians. Once they found themselves in exile, they saw a new attachment to the faith, to the Orthodox faith. Especially because it provided this cultural space where a lot of people actually spoke Russian. And so I think that became really important. Another really interesting thing that I found is that in the mid-1920s, a lot of philanthropic organizations took a more religious kind of orientation. And so like the Christian movement, the Christian student movement, it's interesting that the idea was to promote Russian theology, support Russian students who were Orthodox to study abroad. So it does become a really important link between this kind of idea that tradition needs to be maintained. So again, even for people who were never interested in religion, being a member of Russia abroad became automatically associated with the Orthodox tradition, with the Orthodox background. So I think that it is really a big part of the Orthodox life, especially because again, we see it in various cities where the Émigrés went, they all established a church. So in Thessaloniki, for example, there is a church in Haglao, which is established by these Émigrés, and it became this kind of cultural space for Russian Émigrés to hang out, organize events. So it is really vital. And then the experience between civilians and soldiers, I think it's also very different. What I have noticed in some cases is that a lot of soldiers had I'd say a harder time adjusting to life in immigration, especially the ones that were unmarried. And the reason was that not speaking a language and staying within the barriers or the social barriers of the former soldiers that allowed them to, or actually prevented them from assimilating or integrating into the lives of their host country. So I think there is a difference there. Another really interesting thing, and I think it relates to the gender question that I have done a bit of work on, is that because mothers especially were worried that their children would not assimilate in some cases. So there's a duality here. On the one hand, mothers are supposed to be cultural repositories and teach children their language, but on the other hand, mothers go to supermarkets and they also work now, and they have this experience of, okay, how are my kids going to assimilate, right? And once they realized that the eventual return was not waiting for them in the immediate future. So I think that for civilians, assimilation might have been a more I guess, an easier option in some ways, or a practical necessity that civilians experienced in a way that because they lived in communities that were more cosmopolitan, more diverse often. Whereas I think that, and I'm generalizing a little bit, but I think that for soldiers, the sort of community of the ex-military people created a space that maybe prevented them from becoming this integrated group in societies. Again, I don't know about each country specifically. I've done some work in the US, France, and Greece, but I have seen, I think, a fair amount of sources by now on their lives, and I think that there is a distinction there.
Thank you. Thank you. That was Nikos Pisidis from Southern Connecticut University, Professor of History. And the next question is by Kostas Zivas, PhD student at the History Department here at Yale.
Thank you, Charis, so much. That was fascinating. My first question is a rather open-ended one. I'm interested in the narratives that the Émigrés are bringing with them, and more specifically about narratives of having witnessed Bolshevik terror. That is, being victims of Bolshevik terror, having witnessed, the revolutionary evil, let's say, right? And I wonder whether you have in mind venues where such narratives are performed. I think, for instance, like the press or Émigré literature, or my own personal, very specific interest is courts. And so my second question has to do more about encounters with the law, whether this is more about your sources, whether you have sources about criminal or civil procedures that the Émigrés are part of. Again, I don't know, whether you have worked. So again, I'm kind of guessing right now. And my third question is, rather, I think simple one is all the data that you talked to us about. Where do we get it from? Who counts, numbers, gender, etc.
Right. So the third one is the easiest, I guess. Some of them are really mixed up. So a lot of it, take it with a grain of salt, because I'm not entirely sure, right, how valid they are. But for the most part, it's the League of Nations, the American Red Cross, the Russian Red Cross, and then depending on which archive you go to. So for example, the Holy Trinity Monastery, right, they contain a lot of information about numbers of people who were on a specific boat, right? So that's sort of how we get a sense of who was where and when. But also in the case of Greece, the Greek Foreign Affairs Archive has a lot of information on our arrivals, and I think the British and I don't know about the French army actually, but I do know that the British army contained a large file of the boats that were originally sent to the Black Sea and the Caucasus, and how many people they brought back with them. So that's sort of how we get a sense of the numbers. And then, okay, your other two questions, whether they witnessed the Bolshevik terror. I think they do write a lot about it, to be honest. I think they do write about it in novels. And I remember I was reading the Renaissance, the French newspaper that the Émigrés established in I think 1925. And one thing I found really interesting was they were sort of commenting on life in the Soviet Union, and they were saying, oh, women get jobs as police officers now, and they also work at picking garbage, right? So this is a big change. How has gender deteriorated in the Soviet Union, right? We would never treat our women like that. So there's always this, even if they don't say it explicitly, there's always this kind of, oh, we wouldn't do this. They do something that sounds, horrific, or and I think that there is a layer of terror that is always there, right? That the experience of fleeing, that was probably the most terrifying experience for them. I've read some interesting memoirs about, I guess, the transit from Russia to wherever they went. Again, it's mostly women, which is really fascinating because men were fighting. So a lot of women describe the story of having to pick up the visas, having to secure accommodation, having to do all these things. And it was always this constant presence of there's war, the Germans were there, then the Bolsheviks were there, right? So a lot of they go through a lot of different stages of political change during this time. And I think that especially in the memoirs that focus on the experience of fleeing, the terror is there for sure. And with the legal cases, that I don't know, though what I do remember, and I have read that elsewhere, especially in international law, a lot of Russians were engaged in international law, and I think it's interesting that figuring out this problem of how long can the Nansen passports last, and how long can you essentially be stateless, right? And for a group of people, being stateless was actually a positive development because it meant that you didn't assimilate in your host country, right? And that's a good thing in that mindset, because then you can go back and fight, which is always the end goal. And whereas a different group of legal thinkers were advocating for the opposite, which was essentially a response to the humanitarian crisis, what it's like to be a refugee in a foreign country. So I think that their experience with law is often from the perspective of the legal status of the refugees, right? And crossing borders, securing employment, and getting all these visa documents that I showed before. The stamps, right? Getting the stamps is constantly, this bureaucratic maelstrom seems to be a big problem that they encounter, and it really, I think, bothered them in terms of defining the emigration's existence, especially once it became, it started out as quite global, but once crossing borders had become this constant experience, right? How do you balance between the constant crossing, I think, was one of the problems that they were dealing with. And I don't know about other cases, but I've seen this Greek studies, or not documents of thinking that the local communities thinking that they were Bolsheviks, right? Or these petty crimes. But I think we would see those in many refugee communities that local societies treat in a hostile manner. So I don't know. I guess we also have to take those with a grain of salt.
Thank you. Thank you, Kostas.
I'm Christina Joegalda from Macmillan Center, postdoc in European Studies. I had a relating question about the numbers. So about the visuals, the origins of the visuals that you showed us, the map, you said grain of salt. Where did this map that you began with originate from, and also some of the later photographs? They seem to be like newspaper cuttings, pasted together. So are they from a museum display or where? Yeah,
so they're from most of them are actually from the archive of the Holy Trinity Monastery in Jordanville, New York. It's Émigrés monastery. I don't know if you're familiar with their, so the vast majority of the archives that the documents I used are from there, and a couple of them are from League of Nations reports and American Red Cross, but almost all the photos are actually from the Holy Trinity.
And the map?
The map is from an old textbook, which I can find. I can send to you. Sorry, I forgot.
I have one more question. May I ask it, please?
If it's a brief question.
Yes, it is.
Yes. Go ahead.
Did they think that Greece was backward? Because the ones in Cyprus, they thought that Cyprus at the time was totally a backward island in comparison to where they came from.
I have no idea.
It doesn't appear.
No,
Yeah.
I don't know, but that's
This is
very interesting
interesting.
question.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So that was a brief question with a brief answer. We have a question from our online audience by Denis Vovchenko. Commends you on your talk and asks whether the arrival of white emigres increased the pre-existing Slavophobia. In his research, Denis says, the refugees did not complain about it until the mid-1920s, when royal patronage disappeared and the Gregorian calendar was adopted.
Mhm.
Do you have any ideas on that?
I'm not sure. I do not know, I have to say. Again, I think that there was a fear of spreading Bolshevism, and I think that especially in local communities that experienced the increase of male population, there was a general fear of who are these men. I don't know if it's specifically if it's specific Slavophobia. Yeah.
Another question from an online participant. In your talk, you refer to your subject as Russians. Some of them we could claim were not, ethnically Russian, but perhaps Ukrainian.
Yeah.
Have you seen something like that in the archives? In Limnos, we know today that Ukrainians and Russians are competing over the memory of the camp there. Can you find something about that? Did you find something about that in the archives?
Yeah, I did. And they were indeed referring to themselves as, I saw that a couple of times, that they would say Ukrainian or Georgian. I not about the Greek case, but I saw Baltic Germans as well, who would refer to themselves as Baltic German. But I think that we have to to interpret the category of the Russian in this case as an imperial category. It's not necessarily an ethnic category. So I think it's easy to maybe fall into that, kind of dichotomous thinking of national identification in this case, especially as all these nation states are being created at this moment. But I think that in the case of the White Army was an imperial army. And I think that they believed in the kind of in that imperial kind of categorization of like what Russianness means. I'm sure we can see, to also clarify that, I'm sure that we can, and I know that the White Russian Army also had profound attachment to, in many cases, would say an ultra right-wing belief of what the Russianness and the Russian nation meant. But I think that for the whites, the idea was that Russia is one and undivided, and that is a quintessentially imperial idea of the Russian nation and what it means. So,
thank you very much. And if you will accept a couple of questions from a non-specialist, that is myself. Do we know of any people, any known figures among those White Russians, even those who for some reason stayed back in Greece or spent considerable time in Greece and went abroad and made a career in the arts or in business or in politics? Any names that we can attach to these unknown figures? And my second short question is, did the fledgling Communist Party of Greece at the time show any interest in the White Russian émigrés? I'm guessing if it did show interest, it wouldn't be a positive one, but still, I think it would be an interesting thing.
Yeah, so with the first question, I have to think about it because right now I don't have a name that I can. The second question I think is interesting because I don't know specifically about the Greek Communist Party, but I do know about the Bulgarian Communist Party, which I think had a very interesting relationship with the White Army soldiers that ended up there, which was fear of armament that and that's in many ways the problem that the French experienced when they transferred their soldiers on the islands, which was, we do not want to have a group of armed men who were formerly soldiers crossing borders uncontrolled. And so I think the Greek Communist Party the Bulgarian Communist Party was bothered with the idea that imperialist Russian presence was that was invited by Samolytsk's government was present in potentially a politically destabilizing act. And I think they wrote about it extensively. I think that it did become an issue of political significance in the public sphere. I don't know about the Greek case. I also have to look that up.
Thank you very much, Charis. This was brilliant. Again, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today. And we hope to see you again soon. New York is not that far from New Haven. And I hope the weather is better next time around.
Yes, we should do it in the spring.
Yeah, so thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you to the audience.